UK, and in particular in the FCO. I'm often asked, the Foreign Office, you're the Chief Scientist of the Foreign Office. Really? Really? And I'm never quite sure whether that's you or if that's science in the FCO. So we'll see how we go on that one. But it's been a very interesting experience. I've been doing it for a year, but I've been associated with government for a little bit longer, and I'll probably go in and tell some stories as we go along. But I was asked to make some sort of comments about UK science and things to begin with, before we actually get to the sort of Foreign Office bit. And so, but first of all, I'm going to start by asking you what you think, what are the research drivers? What research drivers are there for government to really get to grips with science, or to use science? What are the challenges? What are they? Anybody want me to give me an example?
Gas.
Gas?
Fracking.
Fracking?
Climate.
Climate?
Money.
Money?
Health.
GDP.
You're all scientists, aren't you? It's very interesting. I had to give a talk about science generally to some very social science related people, and they came up with a very different set of answers. They were things like challenge and interest and all these words like this, whereas you've all done the thing that I did, which is, you know, population, climate change, food security, and all that sort of stuff. It's interesting, isn't it? I've never given a talk about this to a bunch of arts people, but I'm looking forward to it. I'm not quite sure what they will say. But anyway, these are the things that we all worry about. The other thing that's very acknowledged now is the fact that we're really international, and you are such an international group of people. So, for example, if we look at the total number of papers produced here, 1999 to 2003, you can see that the total here of others was 30. If you go to the period a little bit later, that's 34. The Americans were 26%, they've dropped down to 21. Japan was the second, and now it's China. So things are changing. We're becoming much more international. And here's an interesting graph. So this takes some explaining. It's from the same, I ought to point out, it's from the same Royal Society report down here called Knowledge Networks and Nations, Global Scientific Collaboration in the 21st Century. It's really, really interesting for such a dull title. So, growth in international collaboration. So what does this say? The x-axis is the proportion of national publication output produced in collaboration with other countries. So if your arrow, so we're going to start here, that is 1996, and that's the position in 2008. So if you're going in that direction along the x-axis, it means that you're producing a higher proportion of your publications in collaboration with other countries. And this one is the number of collaborative papers published. So that, if you're going up on the y-axis, that means you're producing a greater number of publications collaboratively. So the United States here is producing more papers with more countries. So it's becoming more international in all aspects. Sorry, the trouble with this split screen thing. So that's where we start from. To such an extent that it's outpinning the total number of collaborative papers. China is changing the face of science publications and the amount of work that's done. And that's something we think about. I'm expecting that all countries are like this, however, in terms of the roles of research funders. We have, in the UK, research councils, 5 to 20 years type of ideas. We have Technology Strategy Board, which produce things like the catapults, and I'll talk about that very, very quickly, which are technology-driving institutions. We have national labs. We have regulators and authorities who think really out to 30 years. And then we have industry. And as we go along here on the x-axis, the technology readiness level, that's more and more applied types of research. We're starting to get our act together in the UK, so we are really focusing on what are known as the 8 great technologies. We've finally come to the conclusion we can't do absolutely everything completely without any plan, which is, I think, a very positive outcome for us. It's the first time we've really done that, don't quote me. And you can see, I think, in common with many other countries represented here tonight, I think big data, science, technology, synthetic biology, these are all very, I think, familiar types of themes. These catapult centres are very interesting. So we've just invested £200 million in this idea that we need somewhere for the scientists and the industry people to come and play together, without the industry people trying to tell us that we haven't signed our timesheets this month, and without the what's tempting the scientists with really interesting pieces of kit that they can come and use. So this is really, we're tempting both sides into the middle to play together. And they really, even though they've been only going 3 or 4 years, even the first ones, they're starting to become really interesting places. And I think that's a very positive outcome for us. So here's the Rogues Gallery. And now I'm going to move on and tell you a little bit about what the chief scientists and scientific advisors do. And I've visited a few countries in my first year as chief scientist, and, whoops, sorry, don't know why I changed something there. And it doesn't strike me, many countries have this type of network of chief scientists in different departments. So for example, Sally Davis, just there, is our chief medical officer. We've had a chief medical officer in the UK since 1861, I think it is. Very serious Vernon Gibson there is the chief scientist of the Ministry of Defence. We've had one of those since 1954. We've had a government chief scientific advisor since 1974, and the Foreign Office, up here, I'm the second person. We got to grips with that about 4 years ago. We decided we needed a chief scientist. So I'm just wondering, generally, if you can let me know at some point, how do your countries do this? How do you get science within ministries, and how do you get the ministries' science to talk to each other? We meet at 7:45 every Wednesday morning for breakfast, which there is vast amounts of coffee given out, as you can imagine. Scientists are renowned for getting up early in the morning, and we sort of chat to each other about what's on the minds of our ministers, and that's become a really very interesting process. Vernon and I realised, for example, that the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence hadn't communicated very well on the issue of Syrian chemical weapons. Not a breakfast conversation for many people, I admit, but nevertheless. And so we were able to get together, work out these issues together, make people talk to each other, and then we were able to volunteer to take half the stockpile. These are the B chemicals. You add A to B, and you make C. C is the thing that you really want to avoid. So we're taking B, and we're incinerating it. But it took this network to allow us to get together and put our hands up and say, we'll take those. So these things can work very well. I'm going to go on, actually, I'm going to go on to this, because I'm going to run out of time otherwise. One of the things that we're responsible for is the National Risk Register. And the National Risk Register talks about the relative likelihood of something awful happening versus how absolutely dreadfully awful it might be. So actually up here we have pandemic human disease. So antimicrobial resistance is the sort of thing that gets us particularly nervous. That's up in here. We think that is actually relatively likely. We feel that these things are on the verge of happening, and we regard the likely impact as absolutely astoundingly bad. And I'm sure that different countries would see these things in different ways, not just because the threats to the country, I mean, so here earthquakes, obviously, and in the UK, earthquakes hardly ever happen, but they do. So if these things are on here, they're probably hidden underneath one of the others. So, the question I've got for you is, and we'll do it by show of hands, since you're all being so quiet, how many countries have a national risk register that is talked about? Nobody. So we're really surprised by this.
Well, there is the wise response request for a risk assessment, but it is petitioning the government to conduct a risk register and a risk assessment.
So this is starting to happen?
Yes, it's starting to happen from the ground up.
Okay. This is interesting.
Right, it emits, like your chart seems to emit also possibility of nuclear warfare weapons catastrophe?
No. It's. I may not have put all of them on. I'm not allowed to put all of them on. There are some of them we're not allowed to talk about. But the general concept.
I'm terribly curious about severe space weather.
Ah, yeah, no, that is an interesting one, and one I can talk about. That's okay. No, I mean it's. Severe space weather. Okay, so space weather is basically when the sun gives out a lot of radiation, as it does. I mean, obviously, we're awash with radiation from the sun, and we're protected by our atmosphere. But nevertheless, if it gives out a particularly large pulse in a solar event, then this fries satellites, and it can put big pulses down electricity generating cables and knock out, blow up transformers. I can't remember the life of me the name of the event in 1880 which knocked out all the telegraphs. But this was due to that. It was a big electrical pulse.
It was in the news a week ago that they had a near miss a week or 2 weeks ago.
Yeah. That's right.
Missed us. We were lucky. We caught a break.
Yes, the angle of incidence was just.
They did mention the name. I'm sorry, I can't recall the name, but yes, they wrote about the event in 1880, whatever.
Really irritating. Somebody must have a phone and look this one up. It was the something event. And if you look up space weather. So space weather's a big deal. I mean, as we get more and more satellite communications dominating with more and more sensitive electronics, you know, the big old clunky stuff, that of course cost a lot to put up, was relatively less sensitive because the electronics were much more radiation harmed. So these are a big deal.
So what nowadays falls under non-conventional attacks?
Non-conventional.
Aliens.
Yeah, exactly. Would that because I know you have an office on it.
I've been sitting next to Dr. C for lunch, and I have to say, I told her that she should come up and give a talk because she was far more entertaining than me. Right, before we descend into anarchy, which I think is on the risk register. So in fact, where does risk come from? In fact, yes, you are seeing anarchy. There's anarchy on it. So natural disasters, human disasters. So a lot of what we do is trying to understand these issues. There's your space weather. There's the ash cloud. I mean, we all grounded all our aircraft without really knowing just what the effect of the ash would be on aero engines. And there have been some near misses on aircraft in the past. Of course, in the UK, we've suffered really badly from flooding recently, and we had, because our national risk register is relatively new, we hadn't really used it to get ourselves prepared for flood issues, and we are paying the consequence. In fact, in the end, we called in the Dutch. Are there any Dutch people? Thank you. Okay. Because who knows more about this than the Dutch? And we also had the American Corps of Engineers came and also gave us advice over one weekend, and I'll come back to how we do that sort of thing in a moment.
So in your previous slide, you had coastal flooding there as not a particularly significant likelihood, but severe impact.
Yes.
Would you like to revisit that?
Oh yeah. So this changes every year, and it's a book about this thick as well. This is the highlight, as it were, and this is a couple of years. This is 2000 and actually this one is 2013. But yes, this one that has definitely changed. Although the coastal flooding, okay, the storms were bloody dreadful. Throwing up all sorts of, mind you, there were people who went to beachside restaurants during the storm. You do wonder that we have not effectively communicated, and I think communication is the other thing that we have to do a lot more of in ideas of responding to risk. So let me go on to that about communication. And
can I just ask? Sorry, back to that one. Is the reinsurance and the insurance industry involved with your advising group on risk management? assessment?
Yeah. So they are advising us on their models. We're trying to understand, particularly Lloyd's, trying to use their understanding of their predictions. But they often don't know actually what the actual risk is. For example, I'm trying to think of a really good example. Well, actually, in a few moments, I'm going to come on to something called, hang on. There we go. Right, I'm going to come on to the issue of Aquila. Since you've asked the question, does it matter what order we do these slides in? No. It doesn't, right. So, Aquila. Does everybody know what Aquila was? What happened? No. So this is the issue of the Italian scientists, just like you, giving advice on the likelihood of an earthquake damage process in that area. And they basically underplayed the probabilities, they miscommunicated, but we might want to discuss whether they were negligent or not, he said, hedging his comments. As a consequence, they are probably going to go to prison. They've been convicted in the Italian courts, but there will be a reply to that. Is there anybody from Italy in the audience who can correct me on exactly where they are in the Italian legal system at the moment, which I find, to be absolutely honest, incredibly difficult to understand. Anyway, the question is, where does this leave us in Europe in terms of advice to governments? This is a really serious business for us.
Coming from someone that just said the UK doesn't have an earthquake risk, have you put yourself in a dangerous position?
But I deny it. I said it's relatively unlikely. Yeah, but I know, absolutely. So the question is, we've got the register. So by having a register, does that mean that if the register's wrong, that puts us in a difficult legal position? But if we don't have the register, how are we supposed to decide where to put our limited financial resource in order to address the issues of the risk?
How responsive is the register? Pretty responsive, or does it take 3 years to update it?
It's every year. We do it every year. We're thinking of going to 6 months, but it absolutely changes every year. It's a bit worrying that it changes, I suppose, because we are learning more and more as to what exactly some of these issues are and where. But of course the issues change, the science evidence changes. I mean, one of the things that we've been trying to do with the issue of advice is get some fundamental principles. I know principles are a dangerous thing, but if you look, these are some statements that we've just put together, and within Europe, in OECD-led effort to try and define some of these things. And this is what I've just submitted, actually. It's an important public interest principle that scientists from all disciplines feel able to express their views and understanding concerning risks, their mitigation and management freely to government. I mean, the last thing we don't want is people going, bit risky, don't think I'm going to tell you what I think, actually, because I might get into trouble. I mean, that's a terrible position for us to be with respect to science. Anything that discourages people from doing so would not be in the public interest. So we're trying to establish this concept of science advice being in the public interest. But of course, in the UK, the law situation is very, very different than it is in Germany. It is very different from Italy, although it seems to be very similar in this regard to Switzerland. I was sat next to a Swiss lawyer at one of the OECD meetings, and we found that actually it all corresponded very nicely. So Switzerland and the UK are okay, but it is a problem. So it's unlikely that any individual would be sued successfully, but such a process would be financially crippling. I mean, even if you're not convicted, just going through that process, which might take years, would be dreadful. So again, we want to preempt these sorts of issues and think about them ahead of time. Fortunately, as a chief scientist, by the way, in real answer to that question, I have Crown immunity. Genuinely, I have. Unless I can shown to have done it for personal gain, then I have Crown immunity. But there are two things that actually we think are probably going to help us in this regard, and again, your thoughts would be really interesting. The first is to say, can you honestly tell me you're not doing it for your personal gain? So there's no. Do you have a conflict of interest before you give this advice? And we know the answer to that question, and we just have to say no. And if you think there is, then don't give the advice. And the second thing is, have you checked the literature? You know, what do you say to your students? What do, you know, have you checked the references? Are these the last references? Have you really looked to see whether this is something that somebody said in 1957? Which, okay, references from 1957 give a paper class. I admit it. I like, you know, it's nice to see some old references, but have you checked the risk record? So I think that's where we're kind of heading at the moment. But what happens if we ask a scientist from New Zealand to give evidence on our behalf, the UK government's behalf, to Italy? What's the legal situation there? And these sorts of things become, we haven't worked that out. Anyway, so that's the principles. Where were we? Somewhere around here. Right. So this is really going back to this sort of issue of science communication. And the general public don't understand these concepts terribly well. I think you can agree that the vulnerability issue here is clear. The hazard is definitely clear. But there is great uncertainty. We don't really know what the biological relationship is between the alligator and the bird. And as a consequence of not knowing that, we don't actually understand the risk. And indeed, in this particular case, unless, I don't know, the crocodile sneezes or something, then actually the risk is almost zero. It's never been seen to go on this particular bird, because the bird takes the parasites out from between its teeth, and it knows that, and it's developed this relationship. So I think it's a great diagram, but the risk is actually very small. But it's about communication. How do we get that communication going? And we've been doing this, of course. We've been trying to communicate as scientists to politicians for a long time. And these are two scientists, you can tell, because they're all and they are talking to Stanley Baldwin in 1928. He was the Prime Minister at the time. And they're explaining some physics to the Conservative Prime Minister. I'm not going to comment any further on that. The thing I will do, however, is that it was also being explained to his wife, and I think that is the most phenomenal hat I think I've ever seen. That must have been the height of Edwardian fashion, or is it post-Edwardian, isn't it? Fashion. Isn't it great? I mean, although maybe if you were dressed up in an elven outfit, maybe you don't regard that as quite so. We do, however, not often get it right, not always get it right. Sorry?
She just had a shock.
Yeah, well, but doesn't it look like that? Sort of sitting in a Faraday cage with the head out the top or something like that. Yeah, no, absolutely. Goodness knows what animal had to be cold to get that. Anyway. A badger. Oh, don't start me on badgers. Oh, that really, yeah.
You're the National Risk Register, by the way.
We had long discussions about badgers. For breakfast times, we really have had lots of discussions. I mean, it got to the point where we also had at the same time the issue of horse meat additions to got into various pies. And I may or may not have suggested that we could solve both problems at once. I was told by the government chief scientist to shut up. You do get to a point on these things, you really do. Right, anyway, fracking. In terms of scientific concerns, of course, you know, we think in terms, and it goes right back to that first slide, loss of integrity in the aquifer, seismic events, methane release, that's the kind of way we tend to think, naturally. We're analytic, we want to understand the analytic issues. But the public is going to be interested, not in those issues specifically, perhaps because sometimes they might not even understand that these are risks and what are the uncertainties and so on and so forth. But their general opposition to the oil and gas industry, and from another part of the population, the not in my backyard NIMBYism. I mean, even if you've got someone who is completely comfortable with the oil and gas industry, they're still probably not going to want these things in their backyard. I mean, this is a general issue. I talk about nuclear quite a lot, and if I'm talking with a bunch of nuclear engineers, one of the points I try to make to them, I say, you know, if imagine you're a bunch of nuclear engineers, you're probably going to be reasonably pro-nuclear energy. So I say, are you pro-nuclear energy? They go, oh, yes, well, pro-nuclear. And I said, how many of you would like to live next to a nuclear reactor? They go, this. right? So the NIMBYism is a big issue. So we got this wrong. We definitely got this discussion and debate wrong. And I really like this. This is this issue of trying to understand about how you view difficult issues through different lenses. So this is some work by Parkhill et al. In 2013 for UK Energy Research Centre, and they understand how to ask these questions. Of course, it's very difficult. I mean, it's very difficult to understand how to ask questions clearly so that you get answers that are useful in understanding people's views. That, I think, is itself very interesting and something I've got wrong a few times. But 74 respondents are very or fairly concerned about climate change. In the UK, people really do care about this. And even with all the sort of negative issues on climate change, the vast majority of people get that. They really do. Well, you can see where I come from on that one, I'm afraid. 79% believe the UK should reduce the use of its fossil fuels. So again, we've really got that message through. However, 82% have a strong concern about the UK becoming dependent on energy from other countries. And 83%, the highest of all, really are concerned about their electricity bills. So depending on what question you ask and how you look at the problem, you get to very, very different answers indeed. How dealing with that is very difficult and something that the UK chief scientists are concerned with. And often it comes down to this issue of language.
Are you comparing apples and oranges there, mate? I mean, you're
Yes,
asking...
because we're looking through different lenses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, sorry.
No, sorry. No, I've just got... I'm just going to take some more. Carry on.
Well, I mean, if you've got such a percentage who are concerned about climate change and concerned about the reliance on fossil fuels that are not locally sourced, and yet they're worried about fuel, but they are not the most obvious ones, and that's where science can play its role.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's about education and communication and getting people into the right position and along the right road by getting them to come to that conclusion on their own. I mean, in the UK we've got something called the Science Media Centre, which you have a version of in New Zealand as well. And you have to be very careful here actually, because the point about the Science Media Centre is that it is not a government organisation. It is entirely separate to government, entirely separate to industry. In the UK, it only gets 5% of its revenue from any one source. So the government gives 5%, I think the Institute of Physics gives 5%, the Institute of Mechanical Engineers, GlaxoSmithKline give 5%, and they won't take 5% from the tobacco industry, and you know, so on and so forth. So they have, that's a difficult challenge to do that, but it makes them independent. So whereas when I was purely an academic, I was always turned out for them, always help them discuss difficult issues. They don't never say what people should think. They are only interested in making sure that people understand the science so they can make their own minds up. Now I have to be a bit careful being too positive, because otherwise you don't want a person from government being too positive about them. But I am very positive. And in New Zealand you've got this group as well, who I think I'm seeing tomorrow, which I'm really looking forward to. So, do you know about them?
Yeah.
Okay.
Darcy has been here today, all day.
There you go.
She's here
You
tomorrow.
missed your chance. Oh, good. Oh, that's good. Oh, I'm looking forward to that. So language. So here's an example that I particularly like. You know, advertising. You see images like this of, you know, pure water, and you're going to then be sold this bottle of water, which label of which I've removed here as this pure water source. Pure water. Well, that defines pure water as free from all types of bacteria and viruses. But of course, pure water, by chemical definition, is something that has only oxygen and hydrogen together in molecules in it. Although actually, that suddenly struck me, if you had deuterium instead of the hydrogen, that would be, and if you had tritium instead of the hydrogen, that would be perfectly fine as well. Of course, you wouldn't want to drink it. You wouldn't want to be anywhere near it. But in fact, that would be pure water. And the EU directive actually concerns the quality of the water as part of the regulatory process. And actually, I think that's a very sensible way of doing it. But there's no such thing, really, practically speaking, as pure water. The thing that we can talk about, however, is healthy water. So, science has a real role to play in explaining the language and making sure we're using the right sorts of languages. But we're traditionally not very good at this. So, and this is a very British thing, I hasten to add. Are there any more British people in the audience? Yeah, so you'll know what I mean, and actually, in that case, I'm going to ask you to come up with some extra ones for this. So, if you're British and you say, I think your idea is very interesting, what do you actually mean? Wrong. Okay. And if a British person said, I'll get back to you on that, what does it mean? Never hear of me again. How about, that's a very insightful comment. It generally means you're an idiot. And here are some typical results, which of course inevitably means here am I. That's probably universal, that's not just British. And then at this point I'd like to make a suggestion, which means this is the way we're going to do it. So, okay. And it's true. It is true to a certain extent. I mean, actually, it's more true than we thought, honestly. So, come on. I want some ones.
Clearly.
What does that mean?
I mean, I don't really know, but it...
Yes, that's a really good one. I'll run that down. Anybody? Come on. Must be others.
With all due respect.
I have absolutely no respect for you whatsoever. Yes, that's a really good one, isn't it? With all due respect.
At the end of the day means give me more time to think about it.
Yeah. I hear what you're saying. Yeah, there you go. Do you think do New Zealanders do the same? So that's a commonality. Okay. There's actually, you could look up, there's one on EU Speak, English, British English to EU English, and it's what did the Brit say, what did the Brit mean, and what did the person from Brussels think the person thought? That's really good.
The classic New Zealand one is yeah right.
Yeah, wrong.
She'll be right.
Yeah, actually, that reminds me of the two levels of security concerns in Australia. And the first one is she'll be all right, and then the second one is crikey. There's lots of jokes like this around languages. I think I probably want to study language if I could start again. So the chief scientific advisors get together during emergencies, and we have this terrible acronym called Scientific Advisory Group in Emergencies. And so anything happens, what it does is it gets together and goes, blimey, what are we going to, what's the science we need to get to grips with here? Who do we need to call? What networks do you have as chief scientists in area X? They call these people in, and the emergency include things like the swine flu pandemic, volcanic ash cloud, Fukushima, ash dieback. That's a very different type of ash to that, by the way. Ash is a type of tree in Britain that all died back because of a particular problem. So that became one. And then recently, of course, we've had flooding. I got involved with the Fukushima one as a sort of nuclear, I masquerade as a nuclear expert occasionally. And in that case, I was there not as a chief scientist, but as a sector expert, as a sort of team academic. And I think the best story of that time is that we had to try and decide whether or not we should evacuate all the British people from the Tokyo Basin, depending on what was going to happen to these reactors. And I was in charge of trying to work out the source terms and the likely output from the source terms. And what really brought it home to me was the chief scientist at the time turned to me after we'd gone through these deliberations, and we'd done about 2 days, 3 days of this, and he was going to go to Prime Minister and say, this is our advice, Prime Minister. And he said, do we evacuate these people or not, Robin? And I said, I'm an academic, you can't ask me questions like that. 30,000 people. If you evacuate 30,000 people, 3 of them will die as a consequence of your evacuation. They will panic, they will fall down something, they will crash their car, they'll have a heart attack. It's about 3 people if it's 30,000. 1 in 10,000 will die. So, and then of course there's lots of injuries possible as well. So you don't do that unless you really, really think it's going to happen. On the other hand, if you get it wrong, and all the reactors work together, and a big cloud comes and pushes it all over Tokyo Basin, a lot of people are going to get doses of things like iodine-131, which is going to lead to thyroid cancers and so on and so forth. So you don't want to make the wrong decision. And I thought this was all right. We all decided that was the advice, and it was okay. And that night I went back and I turned on the TV, and there was a poor translation, as it turns out, of the Japanese Prime Minister at the time. And the comment was, "And I must tell you, things at Fukushima Daiichi are not going well." And all I could think of is what the Japanese Emperor said at the end of the Second World War, with "the war is not going entirely in Japan's favour," which is this famous quote, which I've slightly misquoted there. And that's all I could think of, and I did not sleep that night. So these things are quite serious and quite worrying. That's why you've got to have the right experts. So the chief scientist is not so much their personal knowledge, it's the people that they can get into the room who understand the science, because that's what will base the advice upon. So it's getting the science, the evidence base, making it clear, communicating it clearly, and that's really what the role of science is, I think, in government. Now, how long have we been going on for?
Would you say that, sorry, I don't want to delay that, but would you say that everything's sorted down at Fukushima?
Do I think everything's... Funny enough, I'm on the television tomorrow morning at some god-awfully early hour, and I'm sure they're going to ask me the same question. In terms of releases of significant amount of radiotoxic materials from Fukushima, yes. There is no concern that there will be any form of chemical process involving new materials. The amounts of... When these tanks leak, the amounts of radioactive material that they leak is incredibly small, and it's the sort of levels at which a hospital dealing with radioactive materials would probably discharge them. So they are really small amounts. Now, it wasn't necessarily going to end up that way, but at this point it really is. Now, what will become a problem is, of course, they're putting all the water, they're circulating water through filters, and the filters are taking out principally cesium-137, but a little bit of strontium-90. And those sludges are building up, and those sludges are much more active because you've really concentrated the radiotoxic materials. And at some point, we're going to have to deal with the sludges. But the waters that are now sloshing around the place.
Can you tell us how well documented is this? Because I think a lot of the concern that's expressed is because there's no authoritative documentation that the public can understand.
I think there is the documentation, but the trouble is there's a lot of misdocumentation. I mean, radiation generally is a really badly understood and badly discussed issue. And it's very difficult to do the experiment. So we are awash with radiation in here right now. If there was a nuclear accident, which there would never be in New Zealand, because New Zealand quite correctly has decided not to go down the nuclear energy path, because for New Zealand it isn't the appropriate path, I hasten to add. By the way, it's none of my business whether or not New Zealand goes down a nuclear path, but nevertheless, let me be clear on that. But actually I happen to think that it isn't appropriate for New Zealand. It's not the right energy decision. It is for some countries, I think, but it isn't for New Zealand. But anyway, where was I? Oh yes, sorry. It's important to be clear about those sorts of things, isn't it? Can you repeat your question?
Documentation. Sure, documentation.
Right. So it's this lack of clarity is the concern. So if there was an accident and we were to evacuate, that's the point of that. Sorry. If we were to evacuate, we would do so because the average dose you would get would increase by 2 millisieverts a year. The background in London is 2.8 millisieverts a year. If you were evacuated to Cornwall, you would increase to 7.8 millisieverts a year. So you would actually increase, and that's before we start concerned about the effect it's going to have on your life, the fact that you've lost your house, the fact that you've had all the anxieties and concerns and depression. And those are a real issue in Fukushima. There are a lot of people whose lives have been ruined by the whole process. But in terms of the additional dose that you get when you're evacuated, actually, as I said, you would, if this was Britain, you would get a bigger dose by shifting to Cornwall. Now, those sorts of issues are not well discussed. And the issue of, if I was to ask you how many people will die as a consequence of the whole issues around the great disaster that happened to Japan? How many people died, roughly?
We don't know.
It's of the order of that. I think it's 17,000. Anyway, I mean, it's actually shameful. I don't know the exact number, but it's of the order of 17,000. I mean, absolutely astounding number of people. How many people died during the Fukushima accident itself?
None.
2. One person got swept away at sea, and one person on the reactors just down the road at Fukushima Daiichi. There's Fukushima Daiichi and Fukushima Daiichi, and I'm sorry, I probably got the pronunciation badly wrong, fell off a crane during the earthquake part. But the number of people who died due to radiation effect is 0, and the number of people, if you follow through the processes of dose and the consequence to their health, it's either 0 or it'll be possibly 1 person, compared with 17,000 who were killed. And yet we focus on Fukushima. We don't focus on the 17,000 people who died as a consequence of the tsunami and the lack of the possible less optimum defences associated with the tsunami itself.
That's
Not,
true.
Sorry?
That's very true. But cancer from radiation can take 30 years to develop, can't it?
Yes, but the main cancer-causing agent in this case. So the cancers will occur if they occur due to exposure. Will occur. We understand the rates at which these things occur, and it's just based on the number of millisieverts you get. So you can detect the additional number of millisieverts. You know the linear no threshold model, which is extremely conservative. Lots of people say it's far too conservative, and you can work it out. And it's about possibly 1, which will be a tragedy for whoever is unlucky.
But children are dying from leukemia as a result of Sellafield and around that coast, aren't they?
So, I mean, this is an extremely controversial subject, as you know.
But also the Norwegian government finds the Sellafield plant so serious that they consider it to be one of their potential emergency catastrophes. They have done a report about Sellafield.
So there is no doubt at all that people in the releases of radioactive materials from Sellafield, if you look back a long way, and the trouble with the releases of radioactive materials is they stay around for a very long time. I mean, the half-life of cesium-137 is 30.2 years. And there were releases that we would today find completely and utterly intolerable. And there is a legacy. I don't know the numbers. I can't argue one way or the other on the numbers, because I don't actually know the numbers as a consequence of the Sellafield releases.
But it's still a very dangerous plant because of the high limit.
It is on our register. Sellafield is definitely on our register. And we are slowly dealing with that issue. The ponds. I mean, I can show you, actually, I can show you pictures of the various ponds, and you do have to ask yourself what we were thinking. Please don't quote me on this. In the 1960s, when some of those spent fuel ponds were built. I mean, some of the fuel was put in during the miners' strike in the early 1970s. and you know there was such a concern to keep the lights on that the inventories weren't dealt with as well as they were. When, I mean, I can show you a movie. I mean, I've got a great movie of the Windscale piles being built and the chimneys being built. And if you look at the health and safety issues associated with their building, it was absolutely astounding. It was a very different world. And there was no, in fact, we've just been and talked to, it's been in Vietnam talking to the Vietnamese about regulatory processes. And I pointed out that in 1950s, Britain had no nuclear regulator. There wasn't one. Didn't exist. It wasn't until later that people went, do you think we should have a nuclear regulator? So, that would be a good idea. It is amazing.
Safe and too cheap to meter.
And that's right. I mean, that was the ultimate quote. Too cheap to meter. I mean, if anyone ever made a miscommunication, it was an absolute classic.
Did you evacuate? No.
In Sellafield?
No, back to your story. You haven't.
Fukushima to Tokyo.
Sorry,
Yes.
I thought that was well known. No, we did not. We did not. No, my advice was no, and these are the reasons we should not do it. And it turned out to be the right. But as I said to you, you know, it's all right to be certain about your science, but when you see something like that on the television, it does make you very, very nervous. And it's the difference between being logical and scientific and being human. Right, okay. I think that's probably enough. What else was I going to talk to you about? I think probably I've talked about the Science Media Centre, principles. I suppose I could tell you a little bit about my role in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So my role is to underpin issues associated with security, prosperity and consular, supporting British nationals around the world through modern efficient consular services. Science does end up trying to help people understand the risks and uncertainties associated with things. We've talked about science networks and evidence and, whoops. But we are not yet a science producing department. We use science, and we don't have, for example, a dedicated research and development fund. I spend 2 days a week still running my research group at Imperial College, although one of those tends to be Sunday. But I really am interested in this concept of developing a science diplomacy capability. I want to try and persuade the UK government that not only is science a tool for understanding the challenges facing it, but actually science diplomacy, the idea of going and rocking up, I guess I've heard lots of New Zealanders use the word rocking up, to develop relationships between countries, particularly if those relationships are difficult. Are there any Argentinian people? For example, Britain and Argentina scientifically have continued to have a really good relationship. I was told a story that from an Argentinian friend who I've written a number of papers with, that during Falkland Islands disagreement, that of course Argentina was no longer able to send the money to keep the students and the postdocs in the UK going. There was no communication. Continued paying them out of their own funds to keep them going during that period of time. Maybe that was, who knows what the political point that we're trying to make there is, and let's not go down that route. But the Argentinians, scientists, really remembered that. And that's part of the reason, because they did the right, British University did the right thing, that has stayed with this relationship. So we, despite the current difficulties and the re-emergence of current difficulties at the moment, scientifically our relationship is good. So in a few months' time I'm going to Argentina to give talks about nuclear modelling capabilities with the Argentinian government. And that's really quite surprised our consulate people, that is a perfectly reasonable thing to do, and that's perfectly able to do that sort of thing. So science as a diplomatic tool and as keeping those discussions open. We have, for example, a project at the moment on volcanicity in North Korea. That's a surprise, isn't it? That's a Royal Society project that's going on at the moment, which reminds me, actually, I've got to reply to an email on that. So this is really important, and it's because you all speak the same language. You all can discuss science, and even if you don't agree necessarily, you can still discuss it and have a really good argument, possibly, in public, and still go for a beer. And again, you couldn't do that in a trade mission. So I think this is a really important tool that we will be using. Right, I'm going to stop at that point. If there are any other questions, I'm happy to take them.
Could I just ask, how many ministers of the UK have got a science background? Because in New Zealand, I think we've got one.
I was going to say about the same in New Zealand, but you answered that.
Because, and the question therefore is, our Minister of Energy and Deputy Climate Change came this morning to talk to us, he's a lawyer. So do you find that a challenge to try and communicate a scientific understanding to those in the cabinet who are making the decisions?
I always thought I would, right? I mean, and we don't have very many at all. I don't think we have any ministers who are scientists, actually. I think we have a couple of medics. Oh, Vince Cable's a social scientist. He is actually Dr. Cable. He didn't even start his political career until he was 55, interestingly. And that, by the way, that doesn't indicate what I'm thinking, so I'm certainly not going to do that. So I thought it was a problem, but it's a question, do they care about the science? I mean, if I was to ask you about antimicrobial resistance, or I asked you about cyber security, would you feel qualified as a scientist to talk about it?
No, certainly not.
Right. So, therefore, I thought you'd say that, by the way, so I thought I was on safe ground, right? So the point is if you were a Minister of State for New Zealand, and you were in a ministry that had to care about those two issues, you would still understand their importance. You would still understand how to talk to people about those issues, even though they were very different from your usual expertise. Well, the thing that's important is, do they care about the science? Do they care about the evidence? Are they interested in making evidence-based decisions? And those are the battles to fight. And those are the things to convince. So in the Foreign Office, the guy who I've persuaded the minister who I've persuaded to take an interest in science, actually did art history. And he then, this is Conservative government at the moment, so he then joined the Guards and had a military career. So he has an understanding of the importance of engineering, because he wandered around in tanks for a bit. So he understands the significance of technology, and he's really interested in it. And he's willing to take advice. And it's our job to provide that advice and step up to the mark to do that. I thought it would be a much bigger deal, and actually I'm not finding it significant. And remember, despite what we might like to think, they're really bright. Actually, they really are. I know it doesn't always seem like it. there are counter examples, but actually they are. Probably get sacked for that. But it is a good question. So I would really encourage you all to try, get involved and have a go and offer advice and offer your help. And I think you'll find that it will be appreciated, even if they don't always take it, and even if they sometimes are too busy to seem that they listen. They want to be able to have the option.
Robin, I think we should allow you to
have a glass of wine.
Have a glass of wine. Thank you very, very much for enhancing our dinner experience and allowing us to quite possibly anyway, wreck yours. It's very, very much appreciated, and thank you for engaging with us so much. Robin will be around. I'm going to buy him a drink now. So do have further discussions, and let's also at some point, I think dessert will come out or something, and we'll be able to partake in that as well. But thank you very much, Robin.